Before we start, subscribe now so you don't miss any epic recaps. Let's go! A meeting is taking place at the French headquarters currently stationed in Africa. The French commander informs his team that he has received crucial intelligence. The enemy leader, Mazarin, has arrived at Sector Y for a visit. This presents an opportunity for the French squadron to eliminate him that very night. For this mission, the commander has assembled 5 squads, totaling 49 soldiers. He makes it clear that there will be no aerial support. One of the soldiers asks how many enemies they will be facing, and the commander responds that their numbers range from 350 to 500 men. A soldier named Darrow looks at his friend, trying to gauge his reaction. Kang Shan tells him to stay quiet. The soldiers are fully aware that the numbers are against them, making victory impossible. However, the commander clarifies that their sole objective is to assassinate Mazarin. Once that is accomplished, the squad must cease fire and retreat immediately. Darrow tries to speak to Shan again, but the commander grows irritated, prompting both soldiers to fall silent. The man known as Kang Shan is our protagonist. He stares firmly at the French commander. On any other day, this might have annoyed the officer, but today is different. Instead of reprimanding Shan, the commander chooses to move forward, as this mission is of great significance. With that, the meeting concludes. A few hours later, night falls. It is time for the French squadron to execute the mission. Leading the operation is Kang Shan. The truck carrying the soldiers arrives at their destination. Chan gives them 5 minutes to prepare and check their weapons. As he waits, he lights a cigarette. A blonde soldier approaches and calls Shan Captain. The protagonist looks at him as the man makes a peculiar gesture with his hand. It seems like he wants to celebrate their success in advance. Darrow joins the conversation, telling Smee to cut it out. Shan also reprimands the soldier, reminding him that survival should be his priority, not daydreaming about victory. Smee, however, remains calm and says there's nothing to worry about because the god of Blackfield is with them. The protagonist chuckles, telling him not to be overconfident. 5 minutes later, the squad moves into the forest, advancing cautiously toward Mazarin's camp. They tread carefully, ensuring they make no noise. Chan leads the way, scanning the area for any hidden enemies behind bushes or trees. They are about 2 kilometers from their target, and so far, everything seems to be going smoothly. However, for some reason, the protagonist has a bad feeling. Smee, noticing his expression, asks if he's all right. Shan simply replies that it's nothing, just an uneasy feeling. Smee laughs and sarcastically asks if the god of Blackfield is scared, even joking that it might be time for Shan to retire. At that moment, a gunshot echoes through the air. Smee falls backward as a bullet pierces his armor. Suddenly, a hail of bullets rains down on Chan's squad. The soldiers scramble for cover behind the trees. But the enemy assault doesn't stop at gunfire. Grenades are also being launched. Chan drags Smee behind cover while the attack continues. He quickly realizes something alarming. The enemy is equipped with grenade launchers. It becomes clear that they are not facing mere sentries. These are professional snipers lying in wait for them. The protagonist checks on Darrow, who hasn't been hit. However, the enemy reinforcements arrive, further overwhelming the French squadron. Shan immediately opens fire, his precision taking down multiple enemies. A vehicle in the enemy camp erupts in flames after his last shot. Shan then turns his attention back to Smee, asking if he needs morphine. The soldier weakly shakes his head and tries to assess the severity of his wound. The protagonist lies, assuring him that it's not too bad. In reality, Smee's internal organs have been severely damaged. Darrow anxiously asks what Shan intends to do. The captain plans to retreat immediately to save Smee, but Smee stops him, insisting that Shan must leave him behind and complete the mission. His voice weakens as he begins losing consciousness. The protagonist desperately calls out, asking if Smee recognizes him. In a faint voice, Smee responds, "Captain, you are the god of Blackfield." Suddenly, a grenade detonates nearby. Chan quickly checks on Darrow, who assures him he's not badly injured. The protagonist urges him to hold on a little longer. He promises to finish off their enemies. Taking cover, Shan carefully aims and fires. However, just then, a shot is fired from behind. The protagonist collapses to the ground, his vision rapidly fading. He instantly realizes what has happened. He has been shot in the back. There is no doubt someone betrayed him and revealed his position. Shan groans, complaining about the sharp pain in his head. But then, a troubling thought crosses his mind. Shouldn't he be dead? So why does he still feel pain? Suddenly, the protagonist hears someone shouting about being thirsty. Multiple voices call out, urging him to respond if he can hear them. His eyes slowly flutter open, revealing a doctor standing before him. The doctor asks how he feels, but the protagonist remains silent. Seeing no response, the doctor instructs Nurse Kim to check his vital signs. It takes the protagonist a moment to grasp his surroundings and the language being spoken to him. The doctor suddenly exclaims that the patient, Kang Chan, has regained consciousness. Meanwhile, the former Special Forces captain struggles to comprehend what is happening, but one thing is clear: the doctor before him is Asian. This immediately stands out to him as he was used to working with the French squadron, where Asians were rare. Confused, he asks where he is. The doctor explains that he is at a hospital in Seoul, Gangnam. Nurse Kim is instructed to call the patient's guardian. Sean tries to piece together how he ended up in Korea. The doctor tells him he was brought there after someone called 119. This surprises the protagonist. 119 isn't an emergency number used in Africa. The doctor assumes that Kang Chan is merely disoriented after being unconscious for 3 days. Hearing this, Sean abruptly jumps out of bed, unable to believe he was out for 3 days. He rushes to find a mirror, desperate to check his reflection. However, when he looks at himself, the face staring back is that of a stranger. A few days later, a car is seen traveling down Gangnam's Central Road. The protagonist has been discharged and is finally heading home. During his time in the hospital, he gathered some critical information before he was Kang Chan, a 29-year-old captain and instructor for a French mercenary squad. He lost consciousness after being shot during a mission in an African battlefield. But when he woke up, it was the year 2019, and he was now in South Korea, inhabiting the body of a 19-year-old boy, also named Kang Shan. The original owner of this body had jumped from his school rooftop and remained unconscious for 3 days. To outsiders, it seems like the boy miraculously survived and had a change of heart, but in reality, the original soul was gone. The protagonist believes the boy likely died from the fall, allowing him to take over his body. The woman sitting next to him in the car is the boy's mother. Her name is Ri Suk. She was informed that her son has no memory of the past due to the accident. The boy's father, Kang Daegon, reassures him that his memories will eventually return with time. Soon, they arrive at an upscale apartment building. As they enter their home, the mother gently asks if Sean remembers the place. However, the father cuts the conversation short and tells him to go rest. The protagonist follows orders. Kang Daegon points him to his room, and Sean steps inside. After he leaves, the father tells his wife that it's best not to overwhelm the boy with questions. Meanwhile, Sean is left stunned by the room before him. It's far superior to even the personal quarters of his former commander. It's clear that the original owner of this body came from a wealthy family. His eyes are drawn to the computer, but when he tries to access it, he finds it's locked with a password. His attention then shifts to the smartphone on the desk. He tries to use it to browse the internet, only to find that it, too, is password protected. This makes him wonder what was the previous owner hiding to the point of locking everything. Fortunately, the phone has a fingerprint scanner, and he successfully unlocks it. He immediately searches for information about the 2016 African battlefield where he was last deployed. Perhaps he can find some clue regarding his assassination and reincarnation. However, the search yields nothing. Even when switching the language to French, no results about the battle appear. He wonders if he should look for military-exclusive news sources in France. Just then, a message notification pops up on the screen. Someone named Lee Hojin is asking if he has been discharged from the hospital. Sean assumes this person is a friend of the original owner and replies that he's back home. Almost immediately, Hojin bombards him with messages, calling him crazy and asking if he seriously has no will to live. The protagonist finds this unsettling and decides to ignore the conversation. This guy doesn't seem like a friend. But then, another message arrives. Hojin demands to know how Sean dares to ignore him. The texts keep coming, but the protagonist simply responds that he's busy. Hojin becomes irritated and calls him. When Sean picks up, he laughs at the situation. On the other end, the bully grows annoyed, questioning if Sean has suddenly become bold after leaving the hospital. Without a word, the protagonist hangs up, then immediately blocks the number. He has no intention of dealing with this kind of person. The scene shifts to a high school. A furious student yells that he's going to destroy that brat before throwing his phone to the ground. His fellow delinquents ask why he just broke a phone he bought only 2 months ago. Hojin, seething, responds that Sean will buy him a new one when he returns to school. The bully seems pleased at the thought of punishing the boy. Later that night, the protagonist remains seated in front of the computer, tirelessly combing through every article he can find, including those specializing in military news. But no matter how deep he digs, he finds no record of the African battle. He starts to question, was there a deliberate reason why the battle was erased from public records? The protagonist feels the urge to smoke after thinking so much. He searches the room for a cigarette but finds nothing. TSK, the original owner of this body was a damn goody two-shoes, he mutters. Still, he is certain the kid must have hidden some somewhere. He begins checking the most obvious hiding spots. While searching, he stumbles upon a diary. Flipping through its pages, he discovers that the original owner of the body was bullied at school. The entries describe how he handed over all his money to the bullies, yet it was never enough. Sean carefully reads through every word. The boy had written down every insult he received over the years. It doesn't take long for him to realize that Hojin is one of those annoying bullies. As he reads further, he finds an entry where the boy wrote that he wanted to get rid of all those bastards. Sean chuckles, shaking his head. You shouldn't be confessing your crimes in a diary, he murmurs. Lying back on the bed, he lets out a sigh, frustrated by the day's events. Unfortunately, there are no cigarettes in the room to calm his nerves. On top of that, he now knows that the moment he steps outside, he'll have to deal with people looking down on him. The next day arrives. Sean is on his way to school with his father. Kong Dagon glances at him and asks if he'll be all right. The protagonist reassures him, telling him not to worry. His father nods, then drops him off in front of the school. As Sean steps out of the car and walks through the school gate in his uniform, he wonders where his classroom is. It would be helpful if someone could guide him. Suddenly, a loud voice calls out his name. The students around him turn to look. It's Hojin. So, did you grow an extra pair of steel balls at the hospital? You think you're some kind of hero now? He sneers. Sean casually glances at the name on his uniform. Yep. It's the same guy who bullied the original owner of this body. Hojin is about to bring up their conversation from yesterday when he notices something strange. Sean is laughing. What's so funny? The bully demands. The protagonist smirks. I finally found my assistant, he says. Hojin's face darkens. Assistant, he snaps. Sean tilts his head. That is your name, right? Hojin. The bully grits his teeth. Because of you, I had to get my own lunch and cigarettes yesterday. Hearing this, Shan's expression brightens. Oh, then lend me a cigarette. Hojin clenches his fist. I was going to wait until lunch, but since you're asking for it, let's go. He motions for Shan to follow him. The two enter the school's gymnasium. The moment they step inside, Hojin swings a punch at the protagonist. However, Shan dodges effortlessly. His body may be different, but his mercenary training is still ingrained in his mind. Without hesitation, he counters with a punch straight to the bully's face. Hojin crashes to the floor, seemingly unconscious. Shan stands over him, contemplating for a moment. In his past life, he wouldn't have hesitated to finish off someone like this. But he knows that killing a student inside a school would only bring unnecessary trouble. Instead, he decides on a different approach, stealing the cigarettes Hojin claimed to have. He checks the bully's uniform but finds nothing. Shrugging, Shan turns to leave. As he walks away, he mutters, I hope you're finally at peace now, Sean. But just as he's about to exit the gym, he hears movement. The supposedly unconscious Hojin suddenly springs to his feet and lunges at him from behind. Unfortunately for the bully, he wasn't quiet enough. Sean swiftly dodges and delivers another blow, knocking him down again. Hojin quickly scrambles to his feet. The protagonist sighs. Looks like I won't be able to take you out with just one punch. This body is weaker than my old one, he thinks. Since a single hit won't do the job, he opts for a different strategy. Multiple consecutive punches. Hojin staggers as blood drips from his nose. Sean doesn't stop there. He lands another strike to the bully's jaw, sending him tumbling to the floor. This time, he doesn't hold back. He continues pummeling the downed opponent. Eventually, he stops, realizing he still has no idea where his classroom is. Leaving Hojin on the ground, Sean exits the gym and walks across the schoolyard, completely lost. Suddenly, a soft voice calls his name. A girl with a bright smile approaches. I'm so glad you're back at school, she says warmly. Sean freezes, momentarily captivated by her beauty. Internally, he compares her to Snow White. Then, his eyes land on the name embroidered on her uniform, Kim Oh-young. The protagonist doesn't know what kind of relationship the original owner had with her, so he chooses to keep his response simple. He also wants to avoid trouble since he's in his final year of school. "Yeah, I got out of the hospital a while ago," he replies. Oh-young apologizes for not visiting him. She explains that she got caught up with after-school tutoring and was extremely busy. Sean waves it off. "It's fine," he says. Suddenly, she mentions that everyone in their class was worried about him. Sean blinks in surprise. "We're in the same class?" he asks. Oh-young looks at him strangely. "Did you forget we sit next to each other?" she asks, reaching out to check his temperature. Sean quickly dodges her hand. "I'm fine," he assures her. "Just show me the way to class." A few minutes later, they arrive. Sean takes his seat, leaning back comfortably as he gazes out the window. Just then, the classroom door swings open, grabbing everyone's attention. Hojin steps inside, his face covered in bruises from their earlier fight. It almost looks like he got run over by a truck. The students glance at Hojin, assuming he must have gotten into a fight with a gang from another school, something he often does. Meanwhile, the protagonist sighs in disappointment. Of all people, he has to share a classroom with this delinquent. Hojin takes his seat on the opposite side of the room, but he doesn't stop staring at Sean. The protagonist, however, avoids eye contact. Hojin discreetly sends a message to his gang, warning them that Sean has lost his mind and that they should meet up during the first period. He is determined not to let that brat get the upper hand. Later, the teacher takes the students outside. Everyone changes into comfortable sportswear, everyone except for Sean. The teacher calls him out for not following the dress code. Before the protagonist can respond, Oh-young speaks up, defending her desk mate. She explains that he was hospitalized for a while and only returned today. Realizing his mistake, the teacher apologizes for his tone and allows Sean to choose whichever sport he wants to participate in. However, he warns him to be careful since he just got out of the hospital. Sean sits on the stairs, watching as the other students play soccer and other sports. Deep in thought, he wonders what he should do now that he is stuck in this body. Suddenly, someone approaches. Without looking, Sean sighs. "What do you want now?" Hojin glares at him. "I'm not letting this slide," he growls. "Come with me." The protagonist follows the bully, telling himself that he should have finished him off earlier. Hojin leads him to a secluded area where 6 other delinquents are waiting, including Hojin. That makes 7 of them. The hooligans grin, satisfied that they've cornered their prey. They are confident that Sean is about to become their personal punching bag. As they surround him, the protagonist simply yawns. "If you're going to do it, then do it now. I'm lazy, so I'd rather get this over with quickly." One of the delinquents, a brown-haired thug, cracks his knuckles. "I don't need their help to beat you down," he scoffs. Then he swings his fist at Sean. The protagonist tilts his body slightly and counters with a precise punch straight to the guy's nose. Blood splatters as the thug stumbles backward. The remaining 5 freeze, shocked by what just happened. Sean smirks. "If you're going to fight, at least do it properly," he says. "For example, one of you should aim for my head, another for my legs, and someone else should go for my torso. That way, you might actually stand a chance." The gang is enraged by his arrogance. "You're way too full of yourself," one of them shouts. They charge at him all at once. But even though they have the numbers advantage, it makes no difference. Sean takes them down effortlessly. One by one, the bullies collapse to the ground, groaning in pain. The first delinquent who got punched staggers to his feet. In a fit of rage, he grabs Sean by the hair and raises his fist to strike. But before he can land a hit, the protagonist grabs his arm, flips him over his shoulder, and slams him to the ground. Sean clicks his tongue in frustration. "This body is way too weak," he mutters to himself. Back then, a single punch would have been enough. At that moment, Hojin rises to his feet, staring in horror. His entire gang wiped out by a single person. One of the delinquents pulls out a knife, threatening the protagonist. Sean glances at the coward, unimpressed. The thug lunges at him, but in a split second, Sean immobilizes him, twisting his arm until a sickening crack echoes through the air. The guy screams in agony, clutching his now broken limb. With that out of the way, Sean turns his attention back to Hojin. The bully panics, his confidence completely shattered. The protagonist picks up a water bottle that had fallen to the ground and takes a sip. "This is all your fault," he mutters. "If I had taken care of you from the start, things wouldn't have escalated to this point." Then, he calmly asks, "Should I use this knife? Or should I just break your bones with my bare hands?" Hojin's face turns pale. His entire body trembles as he frantically shakes his head. Please, don't. I'm sorry. I regret everything," he stammers, his voice laced with terror. Just then, the sound of approaching footsteps fills the air. The fight is interrupted by the arrival of a teacher. Sean is taken aback. He never noticed the man's presence. The teacher doesn't seem surprised by the scene before him. He simply says, "Self-defense has its limits. Don't cross the line." Sean narrows his eyes at him. The teacher notices the glare and warns him, "If you keep this up, you'll be expelled." The protagonist shrugs. "I don't care. I don't plan on going to college anyway." The teacher folds his arms. "Then what do you plan to do with your life?" Before Sean can answer, the teacher turns around and walks away. "If you want me to hear your answer, come find me," he says. As he leaves, he also instructs Sean to hand over any evidence proving that he was bullied. For a brief moment, Sean gets the sense that this man is someone he shouldn't underestimate. Deciding it's best not to stay any longer, he walks away. Before he exits, the teacher calls out one last time, "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Sean smirks. "I watched some videos on the internet." The man scoffs. "Liar. We'll talk later." Sean doesn't bother responding and simply leaves. The teacher watches him go, noting how much the boy has changed since the incident. Later that day, the protagonist strolls through the city. Wanting a change, he stops by a salon. When he emerges, he looks like his old self, his hair styled exactly as it was in his previous life. Feeling satisfied, he decides to grab a meal. He enters the first restaurant he sees and orders tonkatsu. As he takes his first bite, nostalgia washes over him. It was the same dish he ordered before leaving for Paris, before that fateful mission. At that moment, the waitress serves his meal. Sean takes a bite, but the taste isn't as good as he remembers. He sighs in disappointment. Just then, his phone starts ringing. On the other end of the line, his mother's concerned voice asks what happened today. Sean calmly explains that everything is fine and adds that he'll talk about the details when he gets home. Suk apologizes for bombarding him with questions and offers to pick him up. Irritated, the protagonist raises his voice. "I already said I'll tell you everything when I get home." Without waiting for a response, he hangs up. Sean exhales, then mutters an apology to the original owner of this body. He knows the boy would never speak to his mother like that, but still, he believes his actions are better than the alternative, jumping off the school rooftop. Meanwhile, at the Kong household, his father, Dagon, is furious. "That brat! How dare he talk to his mother like that?" he shouts. Suk tries to defend their son. "Maybe he has his reasons," she suggests. Kong crosses his arms. He's changed since that incident. Just then, the front door opens. The protagonist steps inside. Without acknowledging his parents, he heads straight for his room. Kong clenches his jaw, standing up to scold him. However, before he can say anything, Sean returns to the living room, this time holding 2 notebooks. He places them on the table. "Read these," he says. Curious, Suk and Kong pick up the books and begin flipping through the pages. Their hands tremble as they read the words written inside. The diaries detail every torment their son endured at school, every insult, every beating, every humiliating moment. By the time they finish reading, their eyes are filled with tears. Kong looks at Sean. "Is this true?" The protagonist nods. "Yes." Kong clenches his fists. "Why didn't you tell us before?" he demands. Sean sighs. "Because I was ashamed, and I didn't want to worry you." He pauses before adding, "That's why I jumped." His father's face hardens. "Did you decide to fight back today because of this?" Sean meets his gaze. "Yes." Suk exhales shakily, relieved that he isn't seriously injured. Though she notices bruises on his hands, she chooses not to mention them. Silence fills the room. After a long pause, Kong makes a decision. "I'll handle this," he states firmly. "But if something like this happens again, you come to me first." Suk nods in agreement. "I'm so sorry, Sean. I should have noticed what was happening." The sight of his parents crying brings back old memories from his previous life. His real parents were nothing like this. His mother was a kind woman, but his father was a violent drunk who beat him nearly every day. This time, things will be different. Sean takes a deep breath and speaks. "From now on, I'll tell you everything. At that moment, Kang's phone rings. He picks up and listens for a moment before responding, "I'll transfer the money soon." Then he hangs up. Suk looks at him. "What was that about?" Kang rubs his temples. "A French correspondent just informed me about a problem at customs in Yufin. Apparently, they're missing a document. The local negotiators are demanding $1,000 to fix the issue." Sean raises an eyebrow. "That's about $1,000,000. His father sighs. "I'm thinking of paying it to avoid any trouble." Sean leans forward. "Let me handle this." Kang hesitates but eventually nods. "Fine." The protagonist takes the phone and speaks to the French correspondent. "Pass the phone to the manager." The correspondent hesitates. "Where is Mr. Kang?" "I'm his son," Sean replies. "Put the manager on the phone." After a brief pause, the businessman on the other end speaks up. Without hesitation, Sean switches to fluent French. His parents watch in shock. They had no idea he could speak the language. The conversation doesn't last long. When Sean hangs up, he turns to his father. "It's taken care of." Kang looks skeptical. "You mean they found the missing document?" Sean nods. "Yes, the customs office will let everything through without any additional fees." His father stares at him, stunned. "I knew those guys were scamming me for money, but I didn't think they'd cave in so easily." Sean smirks. "I told them that if they tried this again, I'd have their entire operation shut down." Kang's jaw drops. "You threatened them?" The protagonist shrugs. "Just a little." Suk, still shocked, finally speaks. "Where did you learn French?" Sean casually responds, "I watched some videos online." For some reason, Suk believes him. Shortly after, the protagonist returns to his room. Lying on his bed, he stares at the ceiling. He had originally planned to leave for France as soon as possible. At first, he thought he would need more time to prepare, as his current body wasn't as strong as his old one. But now, he feels like he can't leave his parents behind just yet. These kinds of thoughts are rare for him. He scolds himself. "Stop thinking about unnecessary things. I'll leave as soon as I've fully recovered." The next day arrives. The protagonist is already tired of being at school. He leans back in his chair, resting his head on his desk, hoping to get some sleep. Hojin approaches once again, telling Sean to follow him. The protagonist sighs and asks, "Aren't you tired of failing?" The bully scowls. "Today, I'm really going to beat you up." Sean simply lowers his head, uninterested. Seeing this, Hojin smirks. "You don't have to come, unless you don't care about Kim Yo-young." That was a mistake. The protagonist's expression darkens. There's no way he can ignore that threat. Hojin, thinking he's finally gotten a reaction, laughs. "She went up to the school rooftop when she heard you'd be there. And now you're acting like you don't know her? What, are you scared?" Shan's eyes narrow. That name, Kim Yo-young. He suddenly remembers. She's his deskmate. Without hesitation, he stands up so fast that his chair crashes to the ground. Ignoring everything else, he rushes toward the rooftop. When he gets there, he's met with an unexpected sight. A few students are gathered there. Not just the usual delinquents, but girls as well. Sean had expected to see the same troublemakers from yesterday, but their presence here confuses him. A blonde girl spots him and smirks. "Oh? Maybe you'd like to have some fun with us?" she teases. Sean ignores her completely. "Get out of here," he orders. The girl's smile vanishes. "Excuse me? Who do you think you are?" Without hesitation, Sean slaps her across the face. A stunned silence fills the air. Holding her cheek, the girl looks toward Hojin's group as if expecting them to do something. Hojin sighs. "I'll handle it. You can leave." The blonde glares at Sean before storming off. "Make sure you destroy that brat," she yells before disappearing. Sean, however, isn't focused on her anymore. His priority is finding Yo-young, but something feels off. At that moment, in a third-year classroom, Kim Yo-young finally arrives. She's greeted by a friend who immediately asks where she's been. "I missed the bus, so I was running late," Yo-young explains. Her friend tilts her head. "Did anyone come looking for you?" Confused, Yo-young shakes her head. "No, why?" Her friend simply glances up at the ceiling. Following her gaze, Yo-young realizes someone was tricked into going to the rooftop. Back at the rooftop, Sean pieces it together. He was played. Hojin grins. "Did you really think you were going to be some knight in shining armor, rescuing your precious Snow White?" he mocks. Sean exhales through his nose. "Yeah, she does kind of look like Snow White," he admits. Then, without another word, he turns to leave. There's no reason to stay here. However, Just as he reaches the exit, four guys block his path. Each one is holding a wooden bat covered in nails. Hojin sneers. What? You thinking of jumping again? Shan's eyes widen slightly. Jumping? Suddenly, a memory resurfaces. A gut-wrenching realization hits him. Hojin was responsible for that accident. The bully scoffs. What's wrong? Lost your memory? You weren't forced to jump. That was your own choice. Shan feels something bubbling up inside him. Anger and pure hatred. But Hojin is oblivious. He turns to his gang. Don't think he's getting away this time. One of the thugs, wearing a hoodie, steps forward and arrogantly tugs at Shan's hair, trying to intimidate him. Big mistake. Shan grabs the thug's hand and snaps his wrist with ease. The guy barely has time to scream before Shan drives his knee into his face, knocking him out cold. Hojin's eyes widen in shock. What are you waiting for? Get him. The guys with bats rush forward. It doesn't take long for them to regret it. Shan dodges their attacks effortlessly. Some of them take punches straight to the gut, collapsing as the air is knocked from their lungs. Others take direct hits to the face, dropping to the ground with blood trickling from their noses and mouths. The rooftop quickly becomes a mess of groaning bodies. One of the more cowardly thugs suddenly tries to stab Shan from behind, hoping to gain the upper hand. But the protagonist notices in time. He spins around, grabs the guy's wrist, and snaps his fingers backward. A sickening crack echoes through the air. The thug screams in agony, his hand now twisted unnaturally. The only person still standing is Hojin. Shan dusts off his hands and steps forward. You really didn't learn anything from last time, did you? He mutters. I guess I'll just have to finish this. Hojin's entire body shakes. Then, in desperation, he suddenly yells, Teacher! Shan halts, confused. He glances around and spots a familiar figure standing at the entrance of the rooftop. It's the same teacher who interrupted his fight last time. Something doesn't add up. Why is he here? How did he know? The teacher calmly lights a cigarette. Hojin, get them out of here, he orders. I'll deal with him later. The injured delinquents scramble to leave, not daring to disobey. As they disappear, the teacher exhales a cloud of smoke. Didn't even wait a full day before picking another fight, huh? He mutters. Shan crosses his arms. How did you know we'd be here? The man smirks. Someone came looking for me and asked for help. Shan narrows his eyes. Something about this guy feels off. Then, the teacher casually says something in a way that instantly sends a chill down Shan's spine. A phrase, one that only a soldier from his old French squadron would use. Shan freezes. There's no way. His mind races as a wild thought takes shape. Could it be? Needing to confirm his suspicion, Shan suddenly switches languages and greets the teacher in another tongue. Without hesitation, the man responds in the same language. Shan's heart pounds. This man, he's someone from the squad. Without a word, Shan lunges. The teacher reacts instantly. The two exchange rapid blows, fists clashing but never landing. Neither of them manages to strike the other. After several intense moments, the teacher steps back, eyes narrowing. What kind of high schooler fights like this? He mutters. Who the hell are you? Shan smirks. Shouldn't I be asking you that? They lock eyes, unspoken recognition passing between them. And then, at the same time, they both shout, You're the god of Blackfield. The scene fades. Minutes later, the two soldiers, former comrades, finally calm down. The protagonist asks Dairu why his Korean is so fluent. The man replies that he has no idea. In the past, when Shan was assassinated, he was also eliminated right after. That's all Dairu remembers. Then, he woke up in bed with a woman, and the Korean language flowed naturally as if he had been born there. The protagonist understands and asks for a cigarette, but Dairu refuses, reminding him that smoking is not allowed at school. Shan gets irritated that his soldier won't follow his orders, but Dairu argues that it makes no sense to give a cigarette to a student. The protagonist asks if he will keep treating him like this, and Dairu confirms that he will because no matter how old Shan's mind is, he is still in the body of a child. Shan gets frustrated because he can't argue against that and starts reflecting on everything that has happened so far. It seems that both his and Dairu's reincarnations happened at the same time. He asks if the man enjoyed waking up in the arms of a woman while he had to wake up in a hospital. Dairu admits that his reincarnation was much better. Shan considers starting another fight but is scolded by his former soldier, who reminds him that he is now a teacher while his captain is just a student. He tells Shan to lower his voice so that no one suspects they knew each other in a past life. Moreover, he questions why the protagonist is causing so much trouble. Now that he has reincarnated, he should live peacefully. Sean replies that he is only defending himself and has no intention of staying there long, since his goal is to return to France. Dairu is shocked and asks if he really plans to go back to that hell. The protagonist confirms that he does because he knows there was a traitor among them and wants to find the one responsible so his fallen squad members can finally rest in peace. Dairu says he wants to be part of that too and suggests they do it during the school break. Sean asks if he's joking, but Dairu is serious. The protagonist only tells his friend to handle the troublemakers at school so he can have some peace. His former soldier replies that he is already preparing everything, and Sean teases him, asking if he has become a coward since reincarnating. Dairu then asks if Sean didn't notice anything strange when he fought those delinquents on the rooftop. The protagonist replies that they weren't armed. The teacher gets frustrated and questions if he thinks it's normal for students to carry daggers and spiked bats. Sean hadn't even considered that those weapons were illegal in school. Dairu reveals that a criminal organization is supporting these students, and he plans to gather evidence to report it to the school authorities so that they can leave for France during the break. The protagonist smiles and asks Dairu to put in a good word for him at the infirmary, saying they will discuss the trip later. He then bids farewell to his friend. Later, Sean sleeps peacefully in the infirmary. Suddenly, he senses a sinister presence and wakes up abruptly, thinking he is under attack. Hojin flinches at the protagonist's reaction and apologizes for waking him up, leaving some snacks beside his bed. He mentions that first and second-year students came to greet him after school and hints that Sean has now become the new boss of the school. The protagonist simply orders Hojin to leave, and the delinquent obeys. A few hours later, Sean exits the infirmary and walks down the school hallway. Students avoid him as if they are afraid. He continues toward his classroom and soon runs into Kim Aoyoung, who smiles and says she kept his things safe. She hands him his bag and asks how he's feeling. The protagonist thanks her for keeping his belongings and asks her not to bother him with questions. Suddenly, someone calls out to him. They both turn around to see the annoying girl from the rooftop. She says someone wants to talk to him. Without hesitation, Sean grabs Kim by the hand and tells her they should leave. The girl is furious at his attitude, but he ignores her and continues walking with Oh Young outside the school. As they walk, Kim mentions that someone named Sile seems to be interested in him. The protagonist asks who Sile is, and Oh Young explains that she is the blonde who tried to talk to him earlier. She warns him to be careful since Sile has a bad reputation for sleeping with any guy. Sean laughs, thinking that Kim would be shocked if she met Western girls. At that moment, their conversation is interrupted by a group of men dressed in black, standing near the school entrance. They check Shan's identity using a photo on their phones, making him realize he's being followed. Suddenly, the men call his name, confirming his suspicion. He quickly concludes that this must be the criminal organization Dairu mentioned and assumes his friend will try to stop him from getting involved. The protagonist turns to Kim and tells her everything is fine before stepping forward to face the men, asking what they want. One of the men comments that Sean is just as bold as they were told. The protagonist immediately senses that fighting against all four of them at once will be difficult, but his biggest concern is Kim Eo-young. The gang orders him to get into the car. Sean hesitates, while Kim mentally begs him not to go. The protagonist remains still, unmoving, which makes the gang members laugh, mocking him for pretending to be tough. Suddenly, one of the men places a hand on Shan's head, and the protagonist firmly warns him not to touch him. The man grows irritated, saying that this brat is making him lose his patience. In that instant, Sean grabs the thug by the collar and slams his head into his nose before throwing him over his shoulder. The man screams in agony, drawing the attention of nearby students, who quickly pull out their phones to record the fight. Another delinquent, furious, smashes a student's phone to the ground, shouting at everyone to stop filming. One of the gang members suddenly pulls out a dagger, but the leader immediately scolds him, reminding him not to use a weapon in front of the school. They must settle this fairly. The man hesitates before obeying, agreeing to fight unarmed. Sean notices their combat stance and is pleased to finally face someone who knows how to fight properly. The first attacker lunges, but the protagonist counters with multiple punches. The second tries to strike from behind, but Sean slams a fist into his stomach. The first attacker manages to get back up but is quickly knocked down again. The second fighter attempts another strike, and the fight continues as Sean fiercely battles both opponents. He realizes it will take longer than expected to take them down. Suddenly, the leader lands a kick to Shan's back. The protagonist feels a flash of embarrassment for not avoiding it. He knows that Dairu would have laughed if he had seen that happen. The leader once again tells him to get into the car. Sean refuses, and the man says it's fine. They can just settle things right here. Without warning, he throws a punch at Shan's face. The protagonist blocks it with his arm but still feels the impact of the force. Breaking free from the attack, he strikes back with an elbow to the rival's face. The other gang members join in, surrounding him. Just then, a voice calls out, asking if it's the police. Someone loudly claims that a violent incident is happening and urges the officers to hurry. The criminals immediately decide to retreat. As they get into their car, Sean vows to break their arms next time. The vehicle speeds off in the opposite direction. Kim lets out a sigh of relief, glad that it's over for now. The protagonist, however, remarks that it will be troublesome if the police actually show up. Kim then reveals that she never actually called them. She knew he wouldn't want to be bothered by the authorities. Sean isn't sure if she's clever or just reckless. Suddenly, something catches his attention. Sile is staring at him with a furious expression. The protagonist approaches her and tells her that if she relies on others, they will only use her and discard her when she is no longer useful. Sile pushes him, yelling that he should think before saying such things to her. Sean gets annoyed but decides against arguing. He simply walks away with Kim, while Sile shouts in frustration at being left alone. On the way back, Sean complains about pain in his stomach, probably from one of the punches he took during the fight. Kim, concerned, suggests calling an ambulance, but he tells her it's fine. Instead, he asks if she wants to go to a restaurant to eat tonkatsu. Kim smiles and says she likes that dish. The next day, during class, the teacher lectures about an important philosopher. Sean struggles to stay awake, finding the topic unbearably boring. Eventually, he dozes off and only wakes up when the lesson ends. Frustrated, he mutters to himself that he'd rather be on a battlefield than sitting in class. Suddenly, a few students approach him. One of them states that he is a first-year student, while the others are second years. They all bow respectfully and hand him an envelope filled with money. Sean, confused, asks who sent it. The students glance at Hojin's desk, only to find that he has already fled. The protagonist simply declares that he doesn't want the money and tells them to leave. After that, he goes back to sleep. Moments later, another student arrives, informing him that the teacher is waiting for him in the guidance office. Sean, on the verge of losing his patience, gets up and heads to meet Dairu. It seems his former soldier has already heard about yesterday's fight. Dairu tells him to stop getting involved in trouble, reminding him that he is no longer a soldier but a student. Sean counters by saying that, in the past, Dairu was the one who always got into trouble. The ex-soldier yells that this isn't a battlefield. There are cameras everywhere, recording every move. At this rate, he believes Sean will eventually get expelled. The protagonist, however, doesn't seem to care about that possibility. Dairu takes a deep breath and then asks for a favor. He wants Sean to look after 4 students who are being bullied. The protagonist argues that stepping in will only make things worse because the moment he leaves, those students will continue to be harassed. Dairu then offers a deal. If Sean helps them, he will be allowed to skip 1 class. The protagonist immediately gets excited. Dairu tells him that he will register him as a special athlete, which means he will only have to attend morning classes, and if he sleeps during lectures, the teachers won't bother him. Moreover, Sean should accept this offer because he needs to train unless he wants to be eliminated within the first week of returning to Africa. Without hesitation, he agrees to take care of the 4 bullied students. After their conversation, he walks through the school hallway, where Sile is waiting for him by the classroom door. She says she needs to talk to him. The protagonist completely ignores her and enters the classroom. Sile yells, asking if he didn't notice the bruises on her face, claiming that it's all his fault. Hearing that, Sean stops and takes her somewhere else to talk. Kim Yo-young watches them leave together. The protagonist chooses the school rooftop, where they can speak without anyone overhearing. Sile explains that those men ordered her to bring Sean to them. If she refuses, Hojin will have his tongue cut out, and she will be sold to a brothel. The protagonist tells her to call the police, who are only 5 minutes away from the school. Sile screams that she doesn't need advice. She just needs Sean to agree to meet with them. She begins to cry, saying that if she reports them, things will only get worse. Her family's lives are at risk, and she promises to do anything if he agrees to meet with those men. The protagonist slowly walks toward her and asks if she really means anything. Sile nods, desperate. Sean simply smirks, saying that he knew she was just like them. He wipes away her tears and tells her to compose herself. From now on, she is not allowed to wear makeup and must wear her school uniform properly. Sile asks if that's all he wants. The protagonist reminds her that she said she would do anything. In reality, she thought she would have to do something inappropriate to convince him. However, Sean assures her that this is enough and tells her to call the gang. Sile hesitates but eventually dials the number. The gang leader picks up, surprised to receive a call from her, as it's something unusual. The protagonist takes the phone and introduces himself. The leader quickly realizes that Sile couldn't possibly defeat Sean and tells him to meet up. Sean schedules the meeting for Monday, saying that he's busy this week. The leader questions if he's joking or if he seriously thinks he can make demands like that. The protagonist calmly states that the man has two choices: meet him on Monday or never see him again. The leader turns to the criminal organization's boss and ultimately agrees to the decision. However, Sean warns them not to mess with Sile again if they want him to keep his word. After ending the call, he hands the phone back to the girl. Sile smiles and thanks him before asking for his number in case she ever needs something. The protagonist chuckles, realizing that if Smith were still alive, Sile would be his perfect match. He bids her farewell and tells her they will meet on Monday. Sile is left standing alone. Later that day, classes end, and the protagonist leaves school, overwhelmed by the number of problems he has to deal with. Suddenly, someone calls out to him. Sean turns around and asks if it's Snow White. Kim Oh-young asks if she can walk with him, and he agrees. She seems slightly uncomfortable about something and eventually asks if Sean likes Sile. The protagonist is shocked by the question. Kim explains that she saw them leaving together earlier. She also mentions that she doesn't look as beautiful as Sile without makeup, so she thought he might be interested in her. Sean quickly reassures her that he has no interest in Sile and that they were only discussing yesterday's fight. Kim instantly looks relieved and thanks God. The protagonist, confused, asks why she's saying nonsense. Then, he suddenly realizes she looks like she was jealous. Without hesitation, he asks if she likes him. Kim freezes in place, blushing. She quickly turns away, embarrassed. Sean feels troubled by the situation. He doesn't feel like a 19-year-old. In his mind, he is still 29. Regardless, the two of them continue walking until they reach a nearby park. The protagonist is still confused by what just happened. Out of nowhere, Kim asks if he wants to kiss her. She even leans in, but Sean dodges at the last second, saying that they are just students. Kim pouts, saying that all her classmates have already kissed. The protagonist sighs, wondering if young people have changed that much. Looking for a way out of the situation, he tells her that he will kiss her if she gets first place in the next school exam. Kim immediately jumps in excitement, saying that will be easy because she always ranks first. That means he will have to kiss her. Suddenly, Kim looks gigantic in his eyes, repeatedly reminding him that he promised to kiss her. The protagonist panics and runs away, trying to escape. At that moment, Sean wakes up. It was all a dream. Kim Oh-young never confessed to him. The protagonist sighs, muttering to himself that his dream was absolutely insane. A few hours later, Sean changes into his school uniform and leaves his room. His mother looks at him in confusion. He asks if something is wrong, and Suk reminds him that today is Saturday. There are no classes. The protagonist is surprised but quickly makes up an excuse, saying that he has supplementary lessons since he is in his final year. His mother believes him without question. Outside, the protagonist calls Dairu. Sometime later, the two of them drive together. Dairu jokingly asks if the god of Blackfield is really attending supplementary classes. Sean admits that he couldn't think of a better excuse and then asks where they are going. The ex-soldier replies that they are heading to the mountains to relax. The drive is peaceful, and minutes later, they arrive at Dairu's mountain home. Dairu prepares food and drinks while Sean asks where his alcohol is. The soldier tells him that since he is a student wearing a school uniform, there's no alcohol for him. The protagonist points out that the driver shouldn't be drinking either. Dairu reassures him that it's fine, he has a chauffeur service he can call. Sean comments that his friend has really adapted to life in Korea and asks if he likes it. Dairu had been expecting this question. He confesses that at first, he felt like he was losing his mind trying to act and live in another person's body. However, he was able to adjust thanks to his wife and daughter. He once considered returning to Africa but realized he wouldn't last long in this body. The protagonist remains silent. Dairu adds that he took too many risks in his previous life, so he thought it would be nice to live peacefully this time. Sean mutters that this country is too quiet for him. Dairu laughs and reminds him that he got into a fight just 2 days ago. Both of them burst into laughter. The protagonist then reveals that he is meeting with the gang on Monday. Dairu asks for the location, but Sean refuses to tell him, though he fully expects his old friend to follow him. The ex-soldier warns that the protagonist shouldn't fight, as he doesn't have the same body as before. Sean tells him not to interfere in his problems. After that, they eat in silence for a while, but Dairu can't hold back his curiosity and suddenly asks how many people the captain has killed. The protagonist is surprised by the question. The ex-soldier suggests that it must be in the hundreds, but Sean refuses to discuss it. Dairu advises him to forget about all those problems and fully embrace this peaceful world. Sean appreciates his concern but knows that Dairu understands him too well. He has no intention of abandoning his old life. Night falls and Sean returns home. He heads straight to his room and begins training. He recalls his last fight and repeats the same movements, only more intensely. While his mind is skilled at creating training routines, his body struggles to keep up. The protagonist eventually collapses to the floor, breathless. He starts to worry that he isn't ready for Monday's fight. Suddenly, Suk knocks on the door, asking if he is okay because she heard noises. Sean quickly puts on a shirt, turns on the light, and tells her to come in. His mother explains that she was about to go to bed, but wanted to tell him that she's meeting a friend tomorrow and will be bringing her son along. She invites Sean to come with her. The protagonist doesn't want to go out, but Suk reassures him that he can stay home if he has something else planned. Thinking for a moment, he ultimately says he'll go. The next day, Sean finds himself standing in front of a fancy French restaurant. He sighs, thinking that he should be training right now. Suk tells him they should head inside, and they enter the high-class restaurant. She looks around and soon spots her friend, Song Hui. They exchange greetings. Meanwhile, French-speaking customers glance in Shan's direction, impressed by the new arrival. The protagonist understands everything they're saying and smirks to himself. His attention shifts to Song Hui's son, whom he greets. The young man attempts to speak French as well, but his pronunciation is terrible. Thinking that Shan doesn't understand, he brags about how intelligent he is. Song Hui then suggests that Suk should hire a French tutor for her son. The protagonist's mother tries to change the subject, but her friend asks if Shan is also good at English. Suk replies that he is, but Song Hui disagrees, arguing that since Shan goes to a regular school, he has no chance of improving unless he attends a prestigious institution. Her words are harsh, but she justifies them by saying she is only concerned. Suk remains silent as she listens. Song Hui's son continues showing off his poor French, calling over the waiter and asking for some water. His mother continues praising him, emphasizing how talented he is. Then, she excitedly asks if Shan also speaks French. Suk replies that he learned it on the internet. Both Song Hui and her son burst into laughter. Shan's mother looks uncomfortable. Without hesitation, the protagonist speaks in perfect French, telling them to stop. The entire restaurant goes silent, with all the customers turning their attention to the table. The French-speaking girls from earlier, now embarrassed, nervously ask if he understood everything they had been saying. Shan confirms but tells them that he has no interest in them. The girls blush, and Shan tells them not to worry because the guy at the table doesn't understand French, and the two women don't speak the language. The protagonist was right. The guy assumed Shan was saying something nice to the women at the next table. Suk proudly states that her son is amazing since not just anyone can learn French from the internet. The French woman who flirted with him earlier is impressed by this. Shan is surprised that she understands Korean and invites her to join the conversation. The woman finds the proposal interesting. The girls get up from their table, and Suk asks what's happening. Shan explains that they want to talk in Korean. The first woman introduces herself as Michelle, the second as Cecile, and the last as Cindy. Song Hui suddenly stands up and announces that they have to leave because her son has English lessons. The protagonist realizes that he successfully embarrassed them. He then thanks the French women for their help, but they say they're not leaving. Michelle tells him that since she helped him, she wants something in return. The protagonist immediately becomes wary. The woman asks for his number, honestly admitting that all three of them are interested in him. Since he eavesdropped on their conversation earlier, it's only fair to give her his contact. Sean thinks it's a joke, but Michelle sits down at his table and asks if he's the type of man who breaks promises. The protagonist realizes that he won't be able to escape. The scene shifts to the next day, Monday. Sean is focused on his training, but he keeps remembering Michelle's words. The image of the woman lingers in his mind. Suddenly, a voice asks what's so funny. Sean is startled by Dairu's sudden appearance. The ex-soldier watches him struggle and remarks that he can't even lift his arms after that warm-up. Dairu warns him once again not to meet with the gang. At this rate, he won't survive long enough to make it to Africa or France. The protagonist changes the subject and says he's going to create a sports club for students who are bullied at school. That way, he can live a quiet life without any worries. Dairu admits it's a good idea and even offers to be the club's supervisor, but he doesn't like when Sean tries to change the topic. He reminds him once more that this gang isn't made up of ordinary students he can handle alone. Sean suddenly recites a mantra used in a French military camp. "The Legion is our homeland." Dairu instinctively repeats his captain's words. The protagonist then states that he doesn't care about Sile or Hojin, but he made a promise to resolve this matter. Dairu sighs and says he loves his wife, so he hopes he won't end up in prison because of Sean. The protagonist puts on his jacket and announces that he's leaving. The ex-soldier follows, but Sean tells him there's no need to come along. Then, he suddenly asks if Dairu remembers Mangala. The ex-soldier can't believe what he just heard. The scene shifts to a few hours later. Classes have ended, and Sean walks toward the school gate, where a car is waiting for him. The protagonist gets in, and he is driven to an old factory called Cotton Candy. The lackeys lead him through several rooms, taking him underground. As he walks, Sean memorizes the layout: 6 rooms on the right, 5 on the left. The men finally bring him into a room where the gang's leader is waiting. The boss tells him not to look at adults like that. Sean carefully observes the 5 men in front of him. After sitting on the sofa, the gang leader reveals that his superiors initially planned to have Sean quietly buried, but he personally thought someone as bold as him should be kept alive. He then makes an offer. He wants the protagonist to join them. Sean laughs at the ridiculous proposal, which irritates the boss. The man raises his voice and bluntly states that he doesn't want the organization interfering in his school. He adds that he doesn't care about the crimes they commit, but they shouldn't be involving kids in their activities. The boss is disappointed in Sean's response. He calls the protagonist an idiot, but before he can finish his sentence, Sean orders him to shut up. One of the lackeys tries to attack him, but the protagonist quickly stabs the man's hand with a pair of chopsticks. The thug collapses, screaming in pain. The other gangsters rush in to fight, but the protagonist takes them down easily. The men are left groaning on the floor. The boss realizes that he will have to deal with Sean personally, but before he can react, the protagonist grabs him by the throat, squeezing hard enough to almost snap his neck. Suddenly, a loud noise is heard outside the room. Sean immediately uses the gang leader as a hostage to get past the armed guards. He warns them that if anyone moves, he will break their boss's neck. Using the leader as a human shield, Sean moves toward the exit. However, the lackeys don't follow orders. One of them attacks with a metal rod. The protagonist blocks the first strike with his foot, but more enemies rush him. He does his best to fend them off, but the boss manages to break free and orders his men to finish the job. At that moment, Sean delivers a powerful kick to the leader's face, sending him flying back into his own men. He then uses the boss as a stepping stone, launching himself over the gang members. Sean runs swiftly along the walls toward the exit as a horde of men tries to catch up with him. Several punches are thrown in his direction, and he blocks them with his arms, feeling frustrated that he no longer has his old body to fight these bastards. Realizing he has no other choice, he decides to fight anyway. He exchanges punches and kicks with the men, gradually taking them down one by one. Just as he finishes dealing with most of them, a new group of thugs approaches. These ones are different, they seem more dangerous. One of them, holding a sword, smirks and declares that he will carve Shan's body into pieces and feed it to the dogs. The protagonist quickly realizes he is now facing experienced killers. However, before the situation escalates, a masked man appears, holding a baton. One of the delinquents rushes to attack him but collapses instantly after a single hit. The entire room freezes in disbelief. Even Sean has no idea what is happening. The remaining assassins shift their focus to the newcomer instead of Sean. One by one, the masked man takes them down effortlessly. The protagonist smirks, realizing that his friend is as stubborn as ever. The experienced killers can't comprehend who this man is or how he is wiping out their crew so easily. The thug wielding the sword decides it's best to take care of Sean first. He draws his blade and slashes through the air. The protagonist dodges, but his legs and shoulder are grazed by a dagger from another attacker. Now he is dealing with two expert assassins, both wielding deadly blades. Within seconds, his body is covered in wounds, and his clothes are stained red. At that moment, the silver-haired thug prepares to deliver a fatal strike. Dairu, seeing what's happening, yells for his captain. The protagonist suddenly has a flashback of his time in the mercenary squad. He was always responsible for leading missions, and on his last operation, he tragically lost his best comrades. But he remembers how that particular soldier always entrusted his life to him. They called him the God of Blackfield, a name given out of absolute trust. That same trust keeps Sean from giving up now. He grabs the dagger's blade just before it reaches his eye. His palms are deeply cut, but he doesn't let go. The thug tries to pull the dagger back, but Sean holds on tightly. The protagonist steps closer and, with a smirk, whispers to him that his enemies once gave him a nickname out of fear. They called him the God of Blackfield because he turned into a monster in battle. In an instant, Sean breaks the assassin's nose with a single blow and finishes him with a powerful punch. The second thug is too stunned to react, and before he can realize he's next, Sean smashes his face with another devastating strike, knocking him unconscious. The protagonist, however, is still not satisfied. He considers killing the man on the ground but is stopped by Dairu's voice. Realizing the situation, Sean pulls back. Looking around, he sees that only a few men remain. He gives them a chance to live, ordering them to hide in one of the rooms. Terrified and knowing they can't win against him and the masked man, they quickly obey. Once they are gone, the protagonist collapses onto the floor, overwhelmed by pain. His injuries from the battle are severe. Dairu smirks and jokes that he never thought he'd see Sean like this. The protagonist groans and then asks why Dairu chose to wear a monkey mask. The ex-soldier responds that the animal is popular among children. Sean rolls his eyes. Dairu then insists they need to get out of there immediately and tend to his wounds. Sean glances at his blood-stained clothes and agrees. It will be a problem if people see him like this. Dairu steps out to check if the coast is clear. Meanwhile, Sean looks around and finds a cigarette pack on the ground. He reaches for it, but when he opens it, he sees that it's empty. Before he can curse his luck, his senses pick up movement in the factory corridor. He estimates there are about 20 people approaching. For a moment, he worries that it's more reinforcements from the gang. Some of the thugs he defeated earlier struggle to stand. Their leader eyes Sean carefully, saying he had his doubts that the protagonist was just a student. The man introduces himself as Guang Take. He explains that he came here after hearing that the manager of the parking gang, Jibium, was about to get beaten. The parking gang is the group responsible for running this factory, the same one Sean just destroyed. Before the conversation can continue, Sean suddenly interrupts and asks for a cigarette. One of the lackeys gets offended and shouts at him, but Guang silences him. At that moment, someone tells the group to move aside. Dairu steps forward to check on Sean. Guang raises an eyebrow at the strange monkey mask and comments that by now, Jibium must be utterly humiliated. A lackey reports that they checked all the rooms, and the gang's condition isn't looking good. Guang sighs, stating that there's nothing left to be done here. Before leaving, he offers to take Sean to a nearby hospital to treat his wounds. He explains that it's where his men usually go after fights. The protagonist has no choice but to accept the offer since his injuries are too severe. A few hours later, he wakes up in the infirmary. Dairu is relieved to see him awake and immediately informs him that he needed stitches because his stab wounds were too deep. Sean asks where he is. Dairu notices his confusion and explains that he passed out as soon as he got into Guang's car. Memories of the chaos at the factory flood the protagonist's mind, and all he can think about is how humiliating it was. He is convinced that if he had his old body, he would have won without a scratch. Dairu tells him that he was unconscious for quite a while. It's already 1 a.m. He also mentions that he lied to Shan's parents, telling them he was staying at his place. However, they asked for a call when possible. The protagonist doesn't care much about this information and simply asks for a cigarette. At that moment, Guang enters the room and asks if everything is okay. Shan smirks and tells him that he arrived at the perfect time, requesting a cigarette. Guang tells him to forget about it and instead asks if this guy beside him is really his teacher. The protagonist replies that he is, since explaining Dairu's true identity would take too long. The man hesitates but ultimately chooses to trust Shan's words. He admits that thanks to the protagonist, he has profited. There won't be anyone in Gangnam daring enough to go against him for a long time. Because of that, he is willing to do something in return to repay the favor. Shan gets straight to the point and says he doesn't want his school involved with any criminal organization. Guang warns him as a friend that he should avoid trouble for a while. His reputation has spread everywhere. This means that those who hate him will try to find him, and many others are curious to test his strength. The protagonist simply replies that he doesn't care. Guang is angered by this answer. He reminds Shan that even though he brought profit to his organization, he should still respect his status and opinions. The protagonist calmly asks what he plans to do about it. The atmosphere in the room grows tense. Guang clenches his fists, veins bulging, but soon takes a deep breath and suggests that they become friends instead. Dairu interrupts and tells the gang leader to remove his men from the doorway. Neither he nor Shan wants their protection. Guang then asks what Dairu does for a living, and the ex-soldier responds that he's a physical education teacher. The gang leader laughs and says that despite that, he will keep his men stationed outside. Before leaving, he tells the protagonist to ask for help if he ever needs anything. With that, he exits. Shan turns to Dairu and asks if he should be heading to school soon. The ex-soldier replies that he can go straight there from the hospital. However, he suddenly remembers something and asks if there's something going on between Shan and Kim Oh-young. The protagonist scoffs and says she's just a kid from his class. Dairu then informs him that she has sent him many messages. Shan changes the subject and asks how long he'll have to stay there. He's told that it will take at least a month to recover, with the first week requiring complete bed rest. Realizing that there's no way he can pretend to his family that he's staying at Dairu's house for that long, he decides to lie and say he was in a car accident. The ex-soldier agrees and concludes that they'll blame the men outside for the incident. He gets up, saying he'll take care of it. A few minutes later, Suk bursts into the infirmary, panicked over her son's condition. The protagonist moves his injured arm and tells her that it's not as bad as it looks. His mother insists on transferring him to a larger hospital to ensure he gets the best care. Shan tries to refuse, afraid that the doctors at another hospital will recognize his stab wounds and expose his lie. At that moment, the doctor and a nurse enter the room. Suk anxiously asks about Shan's condition. The doctor reassures her that he is fine, he just needs to eat and rest. She then suggests transferring him to Sibo Hospital, where he was previously hospitalized. The doctor agrees that it's possible but warns that Sibo has an overwhelming number of patients per doctor, which might result in Shan not getting the attention he needs. He subtly hints that it would be better for the protagonist to stay in this hospital instead. Suk listens carefully. Dairu discreetly gives Shan a thumbs up. The protagonist exhales in relief. His mother finally decides that she will discuss it with his father, but for now, it's best for him to remain in the current hospital. The doctor agrees and asks her to step outside for a moment while he changes Shan's bandages. Once alone, the doctor removes the bandages from Shan's shoulder and is visibly shocked by the speed of his recovery. He remarks that this is the first time he has seen anything like it. The protagonist thanks him for convincing his mother, but the man questions if Shan understands why he did it. The doctor explains that he once had a younger brother who became a gangster and would often come home with knife wounds. One day, after a violent clash between criminal organizations, his brother was severely injured. He was taken to the hospital but refused treatment. In the end, it was the doctor himself who had to announce his brother's death. Shan doesn't know what to say. The doctor finishes dressing his wounds and makes a request. He hopes that Shan will survive every fight he gets into, but he asks that he never kill anyone in these duels. The protagonist questions why the man continues treating criminals. The doctor replies that it wouldn't make a difference, it wouldn't reduce the number of deaths in these fights. Besides, his job is to save lives, not to judge people. He doesn't do it for the money. Shan thanks him for the advice, and the doctor responds that, at least this time, he saved him some money. Dairu jokes that the doctor made a good deal. Suddenly, the doctor casually adds that if Shan ever ends up dead at the hospital, he'll make a lot of money selling his organs. After saying this, the man bids them farewell and leaves. The protagonist is left speechless at the thought of losing his organs. A week later, Sean finally returns home and puts on his school uniform, even though he hasn't fully recovered. Just as he's about to leave, he notices something in his mother's hand and asks what it is. Suk opens an envelope and reveals that someone sent him 50 million won. Sean immediately knows it was Guang and curses him mentally. He tries to assure his mother that he'll return the money and that she shouldn't worry. However, she is already concerned. It's not normal for someone to send such a large amount of money. To avoid further questions, Sean abruptly changes the subject, saying he's running late for school. Kong offers to drive him and the two leave. During the ride, Sean notices that his father's mood seems different. He looks more serious. Suddenly, Kong asks if his son has something to confess. He promises not to ask again if Sean doesn't want to talk. The protagonist decides to be honest and admits that he got into a fight. He explains that he fought some guys from school, but they were backed by a group of criminals. However, he assures his father that he resolved the issue without anyone suffering fatal injuries. He also adds that the gangsters won't interfere with the school anymore. Kong then asks why he lied and said it was a car accident. Sean replies that he didn't want to worry his mother. At that moment, his father glances at a framed picture of Shan's birth. In the photo, Suk looks unwell. The protagonist doesn't know the details, but he assumes his mother had complications during childbirth. Kong simply tells him not to hurt his mother. Sean nods. His father thanks him for being honest today. A few minutes later, Sean arrives at school and runs into Dairu. The ex-soldier immediately yells, asking why he's walking around. The protagonist responds that he was discharged and that the doctor even praised his fast recovery. Dairu shakes his head, commenting that his captain really is strange. Sean asks if anything happened while he was gone. Dairu explains that there were many rumors. Some say Sean was killed, others claim he's in critical condition at the hospital, and one person even spread a story that he was arrested by the police. The protagonist laughs, saying that this is good. As he prepares to leave the gym, Dairu stops him and asks what he's planning to do. Sean replies that he's going to handle the task Dairu requested. The ex-soldier is pleased and provides the names of the students. The scene shifts to a first-year classroom, where students are eating lunch inside. A boy with glasses is suddenly smacked on the head while eating. He looks up at the bully but stays silent. The delinquent calls him Jijin and takes his lunch, claiming that he's only doing this for his health. He doesn't need to eat so much. The poor boy meekly agrees. Suddenly, the bully asks why Jijin isn't eating and shoves a large amount of food into his mouth. The students laugh at him instead of helping. The delinquent continues force-feeding him. At that moment, someone enters the room. The bully glares at the intruder, demanding to know who dares to step into his classroom. He then realizes who it is and immediately bows several times to Sean. The protagonist ignores him and instead asks if there's someone named Jijin in the room. The bully quickly points at the boy with glasses. Sean walks over and notices that Jijin is trembling uncontrollably. The protagonist greets him gently, but the boy internally panics, wondering why such a terrifying student is looking for him. Sean asks him to step outside for a chat. Jijin trembles even more and hesitates, questioning why he should follow him. The entire classroom falls silent in shock. A student just dared to question Sean. The bully immediately scolds Jijin, demanding to know why he is speaking so rudely to the boss. Suddenly, the protagonist tells the bully not to interfere. He then walks over to Jijin and tells him they need to talk. Jijin is about to refuse again, but Sean grabs his hand and starts pulling him out of the classroom. The students watch in fear, unsure of what's happening. The protagonist assures Jijin that everything will be fine, while noticing how terrified everyone is of him. The scene shifts to a second-year classroom, where a girl sits alone. Sean approaches her and asks if her name is Soyeon. She timidly replies that it is. The protagonist introduces himself as a third-year student and says he wants to talk to her. Upon hearing his name, Soyeon starts trembling. Sean asks if she's busy, and although she looks hesitant, she quickly stands up and says she can go with him. As the three of them leave the room, the protagonist tries to recall the name of the last student he needs to find. Suddenly, a delinquent from Soyeon's class appears and calls Sean boss. Soyeon flinches at the sight of the guy and shrinks behind Sean. The protagonist immediately notices. The delinquent bows deeply and introduces himself as Seru, a second-year student. He was the one who delivered the money to Sean last time. The protagonist simply waves his hand, signaling him to move aside. Seru obeys without question and apologizes for getting in the way. A few hours later, Sean successfully gathers all the bullied students and brings them to the sports room. He thanks them for coming and explains that he brought them here because he intends to create a sports club. He also announces that Professor Kang Ho will be the club's supervisor. Then, he asks if anyone has questions. Eugene raises his hand and asks what sports they will be playing. Sean replies that he will teach them physical training and the basics of self-defense. They can also choose other sports to pass the time. One of the girls asks why they were chosen. The protagonist thinks for a moment and then says that he wants to be their friend. A heavy silence fills the room. Dairu steps in and tells the students they don't have to participate if they don't want to, but he's sure the club will benefit them all. He points to a document on the table and tells the students who are interested to sign it. The protagonist loudly declares that it will be a lot of fun. However, the students are still intimidated by him. Dairu tells Sean to calm down before he scares them even more. Then, he asks why Kim Yo-young is here. The girl introduces herself with a gentle smile, saying that she will be the club's manager. Dairu questions why Sean brought her, considering that the whole school expects her to enroll in a prestigious university. However, Kim distributes the documents to the students, and they immediately feel at ease with her presence. The protagonist then reveals that he didn't actually bring Kim. He ran into her in the hallway, and she was crying because she wanted to follow him. He couldn't bring himself to refuse her help. At that moment, the food delivery arrives with tonkatsu. Dairu announces that they will serve the students before starting training. Meanwhile, Sile watches the meeting from a hidden spot. After observing for a while, she suddenly runs up to Sean and asks why he's wandering around. The protagonist, unimpressed, tells her to leave. He turns back toward the sports room when Sile suddenly stops and yells at him, asking if he really wants her to go. Sean nonchalantly replies that she can do whatever she wants. She then asks if she isn't being suspicious. The protagonist simply responds that he doesn't care. After that, he walks into the room, leaving Sile frustrated that she couldn't get his attention. Later that day, the 4 students sign the documents to officially join the club. Training begins and Sile watches from a distance. The students collapse from exhaustion after the intense physical exercises. Kim Yo-young hands out drinks to help with their thirst. Ji-jin, relieved that the training is finally over, breathes a sigh of relief. However, the protagonist suddenly announces that they are about to start the real training. The students are shocked. Jean asks if the exercises they just did weren't already training. Sean calmly replies that those were just warm-ups. At that moment, the students feel as if their souls have left their bodies. A few minutes later, the real training begins. A ball flies toward Ji-jin, catching him off guard and hitting him directly in the face, knocking him to the ground. The protagonist tells him that he shouldn't try to stop a ball with his face. He asks if he's okay, and the student weakly nods. Dairu, however, scolds Sean, saying it was his fault for aiming directly at the boy's face. He reminds him that they are at a school, not a battlefield. The protagonist clenches his fists, resisting the urge to argue back, and simply says he understands. Dairu then returns the ball to him. Sean smirks and says he's going to demonstrate what happens when someone intentionally aims for another person's face. He kicks the ball with such force that sparks fly from it. Dairu intercepts it with his foot and sends it flying back. The two engage in a fierce back and forth, kicking the ball at each other at high speed. The students watch in horror, realizing that there is no other club more terrifying than this one. After some time, the training session ends, and the students leave to wash up. Sean talks with Dairu, mentioning that his body is getting stronger every day. The ex-soldier acknowledges his progress but advises against maintaining such an intense routine daily. Instead, he suggests they limit training to twice a week. The protagonist agrees immediately. At that moment, Sile approaches and calls out to him. Annoyed, he asks what she wants. The girl boldly declares that she wants to join the club. Her response surprises everyone. The students who were washing up stop to look at her. Sean flatly rejects her. Sile finds it unfair and demands to know why. The protagonist explains that she is in her 3rd year. She should be focusing on studying and preparing for university. Frustrated, Sile shouts that it doesn't matter since she's not going to university anyway. She also argues that she doesn't understand why she's being denied when Kim Yo-young, who is also in her 3rd year, is allowed to participate. Dairu steps in, defending Kim by stating that she has excellent grades, unlike Sile. The girl lowers her head, looking dejected, then glares at Kim, who shifts uncomfortably. Without another word, Sile turns her back and walks away. Later, as classes end, Sean waits at a crosswalk with Kim. She asks if he is willing to reconsider Sile's request. She seems sincere about wanting to join the club. The protagonist dismisses the idea, saying that Sile doesn't fit in and could scare the others. The light turns green, and he bids Kim farewell. She tries to continue the conversation, suggesting that if Sile spends time with the other students, she might make friends. However, Sean doesn't listen, he's already walking away. As he walks alone through the streets, reflecting on the day, his phone suddenly rings. The number is unfamiliar. On the other end, someone greets him in French. Sean doesn't recognize the voice. The caller introduces herself as Michelle, the girl he met at the restaurant. The protagonist immediately asks why she's calling. Michelle playfully scolds him, saying that after catching the attention of 3 women, he's still pretending to be clueless. Sean repeats that he's not interested and reminds her that he's still a student. Michelle teases him, asking if he has no interest in French women. She tries to arrange a meeting that same day, but he declines, explaining that he's still recovering from his injuries. The girl then starts saying some rather suggestive things. Annoyed, Sean reluctantly agrees to meet her on Saturday. They finalize the plans, though he clearly isn't enthusiastic about it. He tells himself that he only agreed because he promised to repay them for their help. Frustrated, he heads home. Upon entering his house, Sean notices his father on the phone. As soon as he sees his son, Kong ends the call. He casually remarks that Sean came home early. The protagonist immediately asks who he was talking to. Kong replies that it was a client and then tells his son to get some rest. Sean obeys but gets the feeling that his father is hiding something. A few hours pass, and Kong remains deep in thought. The protagonist changes clothes and tells his father that he's going out for a walk, then invites him to join. At first, Kong refuses, saying he's fine, but after a moment, he changes his mind and decides to go with him. Late at night, the two of them walk outside the apartment building. Sean finally asks if something is wrong. Kong acts like he doesn't know what his son is talking about. The protagonist simply copies his father's own words, saying that if he doesn't want to talk about it, he won't ask again. Kong chuckles, realizing that Sean is imitating him. After a pause, he admits that he does have a problem. They sit on a bench and he begins explaining the situation. Kong had planned to import French cars and sell them in South Korea, about 50 vehicles in total. He had everything arranged, planning to import the cars first and pay the supplier after selling them. Initially, the plan seemed flawless. However, an external factor disrupted everything. A company called Sejong established a subdivision called Sejong Motors, which now offers parallel imports of the same cars that Kong intended to sell. The protagonist is certain that these scammers stole his father's idea out of jealousy. Suddenly, he realizes something. He subconsciously referred to Kong as his father in his own thoughts. Kong continues explaining the issue. The phone call he received earlier was from the French supplier. They assured him of exclusivity, but only if he commits to purchasing 500 cars per order. They are pretending that Kong is their priority, but in reality, they made this offer knowing full well that he wouldn't be able to meet such a demand. If he refuses, they will simply sign a contract with a much larger corporation instead. The protagonist asks which model of car his father was planning to import. Kong replies that it's the STFF, an extremely luxurious vehicle. Sean immediately realizes that paying for 500 units would be an astronomical expense. Kong sighs, saying it gets worse. If he backs out, he will lose the money he already invested in the contract for the initial 50 cars. If he goes through with the deal, he will have to find a way to sell all 500. Either way, the financial losses will be nearly the same. At that moment, Kong begins to cry, confessing that he used their house as collateral for the contract. If the situation spirals out of control, things could become very difficult for them. He also apologizes to his son for showing such a pathetic side of himself. The protagonist reassures him that it's okay and adds that he just doesn't want this to affect his mother. Kong sighs, saying that's exactly what worries him the most. He's trying his best to keep Suk from finding out. The protagonist points out that his father's expressions aren't helping at all. In fact, his worry is completely obvious. Kong apologizes for that. Sean then asks how things currently stand. Kong explains that the French executives will be arriving this week. The protagonist immediately realizes that the company is rushing things. His father further reveals that they plan to rest tomorrow and meet on Sunday at noon. An idea forms in Shan's mind, and he asks for permission to accompany his father to the meeting. Kong insists that he doesn't need to worry, he will handle everything on his own. However, Shan persists, saying that he can help deliver exactly what the French executives want to hear. His father looks completely defeated, certain that there is no way out of this situation. Suddenly, the protagonist stands up and shouts at his father, telling him they have to at least try. If nothing works, at least they'll know they did their best to salvage the situation. Kong is taken aback by his son's determination. After a moment of silence, he nods in agreement, acknowledging that they must make an effort. He admits that he will need Shan's help, even if the results don't turn out as expected. He also makes his son promise not to let Suk find out about any of this. Later that evening, the protagonist returns home. Suk immediately asks about Kong, and he lies, saying that his father decided to stay out a little longer. She finds it strange, but she doesn't press the issue. Shan says goodnight and returns to his room. Just then, his phone rings. He answers and sighs upon realizing that it's Michelle. However, he quickly changes his tone and tells her that she called at a perfect time. The girl assumes it's because he missed her, but that's not the case. He actually wants to postpone their meeting for another week. Michelle gets irritated, but the protagonist explains that it's due to personal issues. She reluctantly agrees but warns him that she won't be so lenient next time. After ending the call, Shan refocuses on the most pressing matter at hand. He remembers that when he worked in France, he had a bank account with a substantial amount of money. It would be great if he could access it now, but unfortunately, he has forgotten all the login details. To make things worse, he can't just call the bank and claim to be the legendary God of Blackfield. With that in mind, the protagonist calls Dairu and explains the financial trouble his family is in. He plans to contact the nearest agency in Hong Kong on Monday. Dairu agrees that it's a good idea but expresses concern for Suk. Shan shares the same worry, which is why he intends to resolve the issue as quickly as possible. The scene shifts to Sunday at Namsan Hotel. Kong explains to his son that there will be 2 executives and a translator from the company. They already know Shan is his son, but Kong will introduce him as his assistant translator. The protagonist agrees, and his father thanks him for helping. As they step into the hotel, Shan mentally prepares himself for negotiations. Kong introduces the executives from the French company. At that moment, the protagonist freezes in place. A man walks toward them with heavy steps. Shan recognizes that face immediately. It belongs to Charlene, the captain of the French mercenary squad. The protagonist's mind races, questioning how Charlene is still alive. Charlene raises a hand to greet Shan, who remains paralyzed in shock. His father, unaware of the tension, immediately shakes the man's hand. Charlene speaks only in French, chastising another executive who is flirting with one of the hotel staff. The man, named Smith, immediately stops and obeys the vice president. The protagonist is stunned once again. Smith was another former squadmate. Kong notices Shan's expression and asks if he's okay. The protagonist quickly regains his composure and replies that he's fine. His father then asks him to greet the executives. Shan introduces Kong as the head of Kong Motors and then introduces himself as the assistant translator. Charlene compliments his pronunciation, noting that the way he speaks sounds familiar. The protagonist internally tenses. Charlene then introduces Smith as the sales manager for their office in Asia. With introductions complete, the executives take their seats at the table. A waitress approaches to take their orders. Smith, still eyeing the woman, receives another scolding from Charlene. The vice president then curiously asks if Kong Shan is a common name in Korea. The protagonist doesn't immediately respond. Charlene assumes that he must have spoken too quickly for the boy to understand his French. However, Shan swiftly replies that his name is, indeed, a common one in Korea. Charlene smirks, commenting that it's a nice name. The protagonist calmly states that he is also quite familiar with their names. A heavy silence fills the room. The waitress returns with their drinks. Charlene leans forward, ready to begin negotiations. The translator for Kong informs the group about the contract. Kong addresses Charlene as the vice president and states that it will be difficult to accept the sudden proposal. He hopes that the conditions regarding the monopoly of 500 cars can be adjusted. However, Charlene remains firm, saying that the terms will not change. If Kong wants, he can simply sign the original contract for 50 cars, But if he does so, Sejong Motors will also be allowed to import the vehicles under the same conditions. The protagonist immediately realizes that Charlin hasn't changed at all. His father, looking tense, explains that he has already paid half the price for the 50-car contract. According to the terms, paying the remaining amount should be enough to secure exclusive import rights in South Korea. Sean quickly jumps in, saying that his father is right, as long as he can prepare the necessary facilities that meet the main company's requirements. Kong breathes a sigh of relief and explains that he has already signed agreements with workshops across the country to be used as official maintenance centers. Now, all that remains is fulfilling the additional requirements. However, Charlin suddenly reveals that they gave Sejong Motors the same conditions and received a positive response. Kong is visibly shaken. He had assumed that he was the only one in consideration for the deal. One of the Kong Motors executives reacts with outrage, calling the situation ridiculous and suggesting they take legal action. Sean immediately notices the shift in Charlin's expression. His old captain is getting irritated. True to his nature, Charlin coldly responds that if those words reflect Kong Motors' stance, then he will take it as a declaration of war. He adds that this is disgraceful, but if necessary, he will personally ensure that the company is recognized as the one that initiated the conflict. Without hesitation, Charlin declares that they are leaving. Smith stands up to follow him, and the negotiations seem to be falling apart. At that moment, the protagonist speaks up. He asks Charlin for a little more time. The vice president immediately refuses, saying that there is no time left. Sean insists that he only needs 1 week and 1 extra night. Charlin scoffs, questioning whether an assistant translator is in any position to make such claims. Kong turns to his son, asking if he actually has a plan. The protagonist replies that he doesn't, but abandoning the deal now is a guaranteed loss. The Kong Motors executives strongly disagree. They argue that it would be wiser to apologize and request a renegotiation. However, Sean furiously counters that if they do that, the French company will only become more aggressive with their demands. Kong holds his head in thought, while Sean and Smith quietly await his decision. After a tense silence, Kong finally speaks. He instructs the translator to relay his words to Charlin. From this moment on, Shan's words and decisions are absolute. That means he will represent Kong Motors. Everyone is stunned. The executives immediately protest, shouting that Kong shouldn't do this. However, Sean simply thanks his father for trusting him. Charlin then asks if Sean is also willing to give up the technical support rights if he fails to pay for the 500 cars within the agreed time. The protagonist tells him not to worry about that. The vice president still has doubts about the additional night Sean requested. The protagonist simply replies that he will understand when the time comes. Smith doesn't seem to mind, but Charlin can't shake the feeling that Sean reminds him of someone from his past. The protagonist asks if they have a deal. After a brief pause, Charlin agrees, telling Sean to call him 1 day before their next meeting. The two shake hands, finalizing the agreement. As the executives leave, the protagonist finds it strange to be dealing with Charlin and Smith outside of a battlefield. He knows convincing them won't be easy. Once the Frenchmen are gone, the Kong Motors executives panic, warning Kong that the company now has a valid excuse to attack them. However, Kong remains firm, stating that they have created an unexpected situation that the French company didn't anticipate. He considers it a significant advantage. With negotiations concluded for now, Kong decides it's time to head home. On the way, he suddenly asks Sean if he is really his son. The protagonist is taken aback by the question. Kong explains that he knows his son didn't learn French just from the internet. Sean replies that he can't reveal the truth. His father simply wouldn't believe it. Kong sighs but doesn't press the matter further. Instead, he warns his son not to turn to gangsters for help. The protagonist assures him that he won't. The rest of the car ride is silent. Upon arriving, Sean messages someone, arranging to meet them later. The scene shifts to a short time later. Kong parks the car, and the protagonist informs him that he has something to take care of before heading home. His father once again reminds him not to get involved with delinquents. Sean reassures him before watching Kong enter the building. Then, he turns in the opposite direction. In the past, the French squad was ambushed by an enemy force while trying to rescue a village that had been overrun. Dairu had fought side by side with Sean during that mission. Back then, Sean assumed command once again, leading his men through enemy territory by leaping across rooftops. The opposition was armed with bazookas and every type of weapon imaginable. The protagonist used his speed to flank them from behind. In a swift assault, he gunned down the enemy forces, setting off explosions in multiple vehicles. Emerging from the fire, Sean calmly reported, "Zone K is secure." Dairu, unimpressed, accused him of showing off but quickly turned his attention to the villagers. Fortunately, only 4 people had suffered minor injuries, and there were no fatal casualties. Sean suddenly remembers a moment from the past. In the middle of a mission, while securing a village, he had lost track of Smith. When he asked Dairu about his whereabouts, the soldier said he hadn't seen him for a while. A bad feeling crept up on the protagonist. Meanwhile, inside one of the village houses, Smith had cornered a woman. The survivor was terrified, but Smith refused to back off. He told her he just wanted to have some fun. The woman screamed for help, repeatedly telling him she didn't want this, but he didn't stop. Before he could go any further, the protagonist kicked down the door and stormed inside. His blood boiled as he saw what was happening. Smith, realizing he had been caught, stammered that he was only helping a survivor. Sean didn't listen. Without hesitation, he slapped Smith across the face so hard that the soldier staggered back. He told him never to try and lie to him again. That day, Smith got beaten so badly that he ended up looking worse than their enemies. Back in the present, the protagonist clenches his fist, realizing that Smith probably hasn't changed at all. A car pulls up beside him. The driver rolls down the window and asks if Sean has been waiting long. The protagonist shakes his head and gets in. Dairu notices his serious expression and asks if something happened. Sean responds that he ran into Smith and Charlene. Dairu is stunned to hear that those two are still alive. He immediately asks where they are. The protagonist tells him they are staying at Namsan Hotel. Without hesitation, Dairu slams on the gas, saying that they're heading there right now. Sean quickly stops him, telling him to wait. He explains that both of them have built new, successful careers. Charlene is now the vice president of Concars, and Smith is the regional sales manager. Dairu bursts into laughter, thinking it's a joke, but when he realizes Sean is serious, his expression darkens. The protagonist asks why he's so eager to rush over there. Dairu angrily replies that he refuses to accept that someone like Smith became a manager. He was the dumbest guy in the squad. More importantly, Dairu strongly suspects that they were betrayed by Smith and Charlene. After all, their squad was wiped out, yet those two are still alive. He asks if Sean doesn't see the obvious. The protagonist replies that they need evidence before jumping to conclusions. Dairu insists that they can find proof after they beat the truth out of those traitors. Sean disagrees, but the ex-soldier accelerates again, saying that he'll do things his way. The protagonist yells for him to stop being reckless. Dairu clenches the wheel, then exhales and apologizes for overreacting. After calming down, he suggests asking Guang for help. Sean acknowledges that Guang's organization would be a huge asset in gathering intel and providing manpower. However, he refuses to go against his father's wishes. Instead, he starts forming a plan that doesn't involve delinquents. Just then, his phone rings. It's Michelle. The girl is still at work but decided to check in on him. She asks if he managed to resolve the problem he mentioned earlier. The protagonist replies that he hasn't yet. Michelle sounds a little disappointed, saying that she had hoped things would work out for him. Sean suddenly changes the topic and asks where she wants to meet tomorrow. Michelle giggles, saying that she doesn't care about the location as long as she's with him. Taking the opportunity, the protagonist arranges for them to meet at a hotel. Michelle is thrilled at the idea, but then she teasingly asks if she should bring her friends. Sean immediately confirms, telling her to bring them all. She asks which hotel, and he tells her to meet at Namsan Hotel at 7 p.m. Michelle agrees, saying she'll be there. After the call ends, Dairu smirks and asks who she was. The protagonist casually responds that she's a beautiful French woman. Dairu assumes that Sean is planning to have fun, but the protagonist tells him to use his brain. Their enemies are Smith and Charlene. Dairu finally understands Sean is using the girls as bait. With that in mind, the protagonist calls the hotel and asks to speak with Charlene. An assistant answers, saying they'll relay the message to the vice president. Sean schedules a business meeting with Charlene for Tuesday at 7 p.m. The person on the other end confirms the appointment. Before ending the call, the protagonist casually mentions that he has another engagement at the hotel tomorrow night with a few ladies. However, The other party shouldn't misunderstand the situation. Surprisingly, Smit is the one who responds. He chuckles and says he's jealous before ending the call. Dairu, caught off guard, says that Smit's reaction wasn't what he expected. He wonders if his personality has changed. Sean assumes that since Charlene was nearby, Smit was probably restraining himself. But he is certain that tomorrow, Smit won't be able to resist showing up to see the beautiful French girls. Dairu agrees, saying that Smit is still the same as ever. The protagonist then gives Dairu his instructions. He orders him to come along tomorrow night. He is absolutely certain that Smit will go crazy when Michelle and the others arrive at the hotel. That will be the perfect time for Dairu to strike. Dairu is excited about the plan. He immediately starts scouting for a secluded place where he can take Smit. He then grins and says that he will personally destroy the man. Sean asks if he'll be okay handling it alone. Dairu confidently states that he can take Smit by himself. The protagonist reminds him that things are different now. Maybe in the past, Dairu could have easily beaten Smit, but their current bodies are weaker than before. Not to mention, Smit used to be good at arm wrestling with Dairu. Dairu recalls the matches they used to have back in the squad. Even so, he reassures Sean that he'll be fine. Every time Dairu lost to Smit in arm wrestling, it was because he used his right arm instead of his left. The protagonist acknowledges this but reminds him that they no longer have their soldier bodies, while Smit still does. Dairu laughs, saying he was just joking. Sean exhales in relief and assures him that he'll help capture Smit, but he warns Dairu that if things go wrong, Smit may have to be eliminated. Dairu nods in agreement, adding that if they're lucky, they might be able to solve Kang's problem and destroy the traitors at the same time. Both men seem excited to put the plan into action, though Dairu confesses he's a little nervous. Sean admits that he is too. As Dairu drives, the protagonist remains focused on how they'll capture Smit. He understands that elite soldiers like them are on a different level. Smit is far more skilled than any gangster they've encountered so far. Later that evening, Dairu drops Sean off at home. Before leaving, he mentions that he knows a few good places to take Smit and asks if the captain wants a list. The protagonist responds that he'll leave those details up to Dairu. With that, the soldier drives away. As Sean steps inside, he finds his father making rice porridge. Kang explains that Suk hasn't been feeling well ever since she learned about their family's financial situation. He also suggests that his son get some rest. The next morning, Kang drives the protagonist to school, looking completely exhausted. Sean reassures him that he's reached out to some people who know the executives at Concars, and they're looking into possible solutions. Kang once again pleads with him not to get involved in anything illegal just to help the family. The protagonist promises that he won't. As the car stops in front of the school, Dairu is already there, waiting for him. Later, during class, the protagonist, as always, struggles to stay awake. Kang Ho notices and smirks at his predicament. After school, it's time for training. Kim Oh-young enthusiastically encourages the club members, shouting for them to keep going. Meanwhile, Sile watches from a distance. Hours later, as the day ends, Kim asks if she can walk home with Sean. However, he tells her that he has other plans. She immediately asks if he's going to meet a girl. The protagonist replies that he's going to see Professor Kang Ho. Kim insists that she should come along, reminding him that she's the club's manager. Sean, however, refuses, saying she can't go. Then, without waiting for a response, he walks away. Kim is left standing there, disappointed. As he descends the school stairs, a loud voice interrupts his thoughts. Sile shouts at him again, asking to join the club. Without stopping, he tells her they'll talk about it later. Sean enters the sports room and notices that Dairu is dressed in a formal suit. He immediately tells him that dressing like that might be a bad idea. Dairu asks if it's really that bad. The protagonist sighs, realizing it's pointless to argue, and just tells him to do whatever he wants. Then, he asks if Dairu brought his clothes for later. The soldier says it's better to change in the car. However, Sean disagrees, saying there's not enough space in the vehicle. On the other hand, Dairu worries about drawing too much attention if people see them leaving school in suits. In the end, Dairu tells him to figure it out himself. As night falls, Dairu parks near Namsan Hotel and tells Sean that he'll wait in the underground parking lot. The protagonist suggests that he wait inside the hotel's coffee shop instead. After all, Smit won't recognize him. He has a completely different body now. Dairu hesitates, saying his wife will kill him if she finds out what he's up to. However, he knows this is a rare opportunity to capture Smith, so he tells Sean to get out of the car so he can go park. The protagonist complies and heads inside. Upon entering, he realizes that Michelle hasn't arrived yet, so he decides to wait. Suddenly, someone calls him boss. Sean turns around, confused. He doesn't recognize the man. The stranger introduces himself as Dusuk, one of Guang's men. The gangster grins and tells Sean that he works at the hotel, so if he needs anything, he should just ask. The protagonist, not wanting any interruptions, tells him to leave. Dusuk obeys, walking away without argument. Sean sits down on a sofa and wonders why a gangster like Dusuk is working here. This could be problematic if he finds out about the plan. Just then, his thoughts are interrupted. Michelle and her friends arrive. They are so stunning that they immediately attract the attention of everyone in the lobby. The protagonist prepares to put his plan into action. The girls chat among themselves in French, commenting on how well-dressed Sean looks and saying that he's more handsome than ever. Dairu, watching from a distance, gives a small nod to signal that everything is proceeding according to plan. Michelle pouts, complaining that Sean isn't paying attention to them. The protagonist casually replies that they're all talking at the same time, so he couldn't keep up. He then asks them to speak one at a time. Michelle asks what the plans are for tonight. Sean tells her that they'll head to another location first. Dairu keeps his eyes locked on the group, ensuring that Sean follows the plan precisely. The protagonist leads the girls to a dining table. Just as they sit down, a hotel staff member arrives with an array of luxurious dishes. Sean is confused, he hasn't placed an order yet. The waiter politely explains that these dishes were prearranged and already paid for. The protagonist instantly wonders who could have done this. The staff member then adds that these are the most expensive dishes in the hotel. The protagonist decides not to dwell on the matter any further. Michelle requests the wine menu and then turns to Sean, remarking that he must be someone important. The protagonist simply responds that he just has some acquaintances in the hotel. Michelle becomes even more intrigued by him. On the other hand, Sean silently curses the gangsters. He's convinced this must be their doing. The wine finally arrives, but the protagonist sticks to drinking soda. When Michelle presses him to join them, he explains that he's still a student. She insists that breaking the rules once in a while isn't a big deal. The other girls drink as well, but they soon start complaining about how much Michelle is consuming. Half an hour passes, and Sean learns more about the women. All of them are 26 years old and met while working together at some point. Currently, Michelle is a magazine editor, Cecile works in security, and Cindy is a freelancer. So far, everything seems to be going smoothly. At that moment, the protagonist's phone rings. He excuses himself to answer it. At first, he assumes it's Dairu, but upon checking, he realizes it's Guang. Annoyed, he picks up. The gangster leader immediately remarks that he knows Sean is in a suit at Namsan Hotel. The protagonist snaps back that it's none of his business. Guang chuckles, saying that there's no need to be so hostile, he just wants to be his friend. He also adds that Sean can always ask Suk for help. If he does, Guang will handle most of the work himself. The protagonist abruptly ends the call. When he returns, Michelle eyes him suspiciously and tells him he's acting strange. It's as if he scheduled this date while juggling 1,000 other things at once. She confidently declares that her intuition tells her she isn't wrong. The protagonist decides there's no reason to keep hiding the truth. If anything, Michelle might be able to help him. He explains that there's an American named Smith staying at the hotel, and he's expecting him to show up here soon. Michelle folds her arms and asks if that's the real reason he invited them tonight. Sean admits that, in a way, yes, but he genuinely needs to confirm something in person. He apologizes for involving her in this. Michelle remains deep in thought, while the other two women don't seem happy with the revelation. A tense silence falls over the table. Then, unexpectedly, Michelle sighs and says she'll forgive him this time since he was honest. This means he won't receive any punishment, for now. The other girls, after a moment of hesitation, agree with her. Cecile even remarks that it would be fun if more people joined them tonight. The protagonist breathes a sigh of relief. Everything is still on track. Just then, he receives a message from Dairu. Smith is here. Sean immediately assumes that they can proceed to the club, but Dairu sends another message in French. Not yet. The Viper is right in front of me. The protagonist's eyes widen. Dairu just identified a gang called the Venomous Viper, a French organization known for its brutality. Sean asks if he's sure. Dairu confirms. He managed to spot the red snake tattoo on the hands of 3 men nearby. However, he's almost certain there are more of them in the hotel. The venomous viper is known for its deadly efficiency. Dairu even fought some of them in Paris before. There's no way he could be mistaken. Shan's mind races. Could they have been hired as bodyguards for Charlene and Smith? Dairu messages again. It's best to abort the plan today. We can't take these guys on. At first, the protagonist agrees. But then he realizes something. If the venomous viper is here tonight, they'll still be here tomorrow. If anything, delaying the confrontation could make things even worse. Fighting all of them and dealing with Charlene at the same time would be impossible. Then, another message arrives. They're heading into the club. Sean clenches his fists. His plan is falling apart. The enemy heads toward the underground club, descending a staircase illuminated by bright neon lights. The women notice that Sean suddenly looks tense. Meanwhile, he frantically searches for a backup plan. With no other options, he calls out to Dusuk. The gangster immediately comes over, and Sean gets straight to the point. He informs him that 4 foreigners just entered the club. He wants Dusuk to evacuate everyone as soon as he steps inside. Dusuk shrugs and replies that he can't do anything without orders from his boss. The protagonist doesn't argue. Instead, he immediately calls Guang. He bluntly tells him to shut down the club for the night. Guang is caught off guard and asks why. Sean impatiently says he doesn't have time to explain. The gang leader hesitates before responding that he can't. He only owns part of the club. To shut it down, he'd need approval from the other investors. Sean doesn't hesitate. If I survive tonight, I'll grant you one request. Anything you want. Guang goes silent. Then, after a few seconds, he asks, anything. The protagonist hands the phone over to Dusuk, waiting for Guang's answer. The gangster relays the message to his boss. He tells him that Shan's request isn't just to shut down the club. He also wants to trap the 4 foreigners inside while evacuating everyone else. The phone returns to the protagonist's hand after a few minutes of conversation. Guang has agreed to help, but only on the condition that Shan takes some of his men in case things get out of control. Guang adds that within 30 minutes, some of the strongest fighters in his squad will arrive. The protagonist sees this as an advantage. If Guang's men can hold off the French gangsters, their chances of success will increase. He accepts the condition and instructs Guang to proceed with shutting down the club. Shan hangs up. Michelle, noticing his tense expression, asks if something is wrong. Shan, staying honest, informs her that members of the Venomous Viper gang are here. The girls are shocked. They know about this infamous French gang. The protagonist urges them to leave before things escalate. Michelle, hesitant, asks if there's anything she can do to help. Sean takes one look at her worried face and shakes his head. There's nothing she can do. Besides, he plans to return to France someday, and he doesn't want her to get caught up in something dangerous just for being seen with him. After saying that, the protagonist stands up and bids them farewell. Before leaving, he entrusts Dusuk with taking care of the girls. The gangster nods in understanding. Sean exits the hotel restaurant and walks toward the club's underground entrance. As he moves through the crowd, he wonders if everything will go as planned. Dairu joins him, and together they descend the stairs into the club. While moving, the protagonist finalizes his strategy. Step 1. Avoid being noticed by the Venomous Viper members. Step 2. Take down 2 of them with a single strike before they realize what's happening. The key to success? The gangsters must not realize their true intentions. Dairu whispers a concern. What if the gangsters are armed? Sean reassures him. This is Korea. They wouldn't risk using guns unless they knew something was coming. At that moment, several disgruntled women exit the club, complaining about being forced to leave. They just came in and told us to leave. How rude. The protagonist smirks. Song came through. Finally, they enter the main club hall. The atmosphere is chaotic. Alcohol is flowing, people are dancing, and the music is pounding. Fortunately, there are far fewer people than usual thanks to the evacuation efforts. Dairu discreetly points out the Venomous Viper members. Sean walks toward them until he spots someone else. Schmidt. The American greets Sean with a casual smirk. Where are the beautiful ladies you promised? The protagonist quickly plays along. They haven't arrived yet. Schmidt shrugs. Shame. Then he pats the seat next to him. Sit down, have a drink with me. Sean obliges, cautiously lowering himself into the seat beside Schmidt. Smit eyes Dairu. And who's your friend? The protagonist responds smoothly. Just a guy who helped bring in some girls. You'll like him. He introduces Dairu as Suk. Smit, now in a cheerful mood, offers a drink to Suk, claiming it's a pleasure to meet him. Dairu accepts, hiding his disgust. Meanwhile, the club begins emptying out. Smit frowns, clearly annoyed. What's going on? I thought Koreans loved drinking. The place was packed just a moment ago. Sean leans forward slightly, smirking. Don't worry. The show's about to begin. At that moment, the club doors lock shut. One of the venomous Viper guards stiffens. Something's wrong. Sean grins. It's time. Dairu strikes first. A single punch, one of the gangsters is knocked out cold. Smit immediately tries to flee. At the same time, all hell breaks loose. Sean grabs a glass bottle, smashes it, and lunges at the remaining guards. Glass shards scatter as he takes one of them down with a clean strike. The club floor is quickly stained red. Smit, in full panic, attempts to escape. But before he can, Dairu grabs him. Smit struggles, but Dairu is too fast. He tackles him to the ground, pinning him. Then, with raw anger, Dairu rains down punches on Smit's face. Meanwhile, Sean continues fighting off the last remaining gangsters. The final guard, realizing he can't win in hand-to-hand combat, reaches into his suit. Sean instantly recognizes the motion. His eyes widen. A knife? That's it for part 1 of this insane manhwa recap. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to smash that like button and leave a comment asking for part 2. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. More epic stories are coming soon. So stay tuned. See you in the next one.